started in a few states. But back in 2020, the last debate was held on October 22nd. This CNN debate that's been proposed would be held on October 23rd. Seems he's doing anything to avoid the humiliation he endured last time. A spectacle in which Vice President Harris exposed Donald Trump as being manifestly unfit for office.
One does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government, and Donald Trump certainly, should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. So let's be clear about that. And clearly he is having a very difficult time processing that. It is absolutely well known that these dictators and autocrats are rooting for you to be president again because they're so clear they can manipulate you with flattery and favors. I'm going to tell you that I have traveled the world as Vice President of the United States, and world leaders are laughing at Donald Trump. I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
And there's more. Brand new reporting reveals that Team Trump has been reeling internally ever since that night, having to defend Trump's crazy claim about Haitian immigrants facing concerns from across the GOP that the candidate the party went with a third time, even after his failed coup attempt. The candidate clearly in the fat Elvis stage of his career, as our friend Charlie Sykes puts it, might not be up to the job this time. From the Washington Post, quote, inside and outside the campaign, advisors and confidants have urged Trump to define Harris more aggressively, including a few who say they're unconvinced that his chosen nicknames are the right ones. Allies have grown concerned that Trump and the Republicans are being outspent in almost every state, some by large margins, and that Democrats are far outraising Republicans. Trump also spent several days after the debate calling allies to tell them how well he'd done, which struck some as defensive. How about delusional? On top of all that, there's more. Harris is consolidating support from people not traditionally associated with the Democratic Party, or even politics for that matter. More than 700 current and former national security officials are out with a resounding endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris. They write this in part, quote, we are former public servants who swore an oath to the Constitution. Many of us risked our lives for it. We are retired generals, admirals, senior non-commissioned officers, ambassadors, and senior civilian national security leaders. We are Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We are loyal to the ideals of our nation, like freedom and democracy and the rule of law, not to any one individual or party. This election is a choice between serious leadership and vengeful impulsiveness. It is a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. Vice President Harris defends America's democratic ideals, while former President Donald Trump endangers them. We do not make such an assessment lightly. We are trained to make sober, rational decisions. That is how we know Vice President Harris would make an excellent commander-in-chief, while Mr. Trump has proven he is not up to the job. That is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former senator and host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill's here. Also joining us, David Jolly, a former Republican congressman, now an MSNBC political analyst. And with me at the table for the hour, distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude is here. Claire, I start with you. I know that when you were in this position, and 5 points nationally ain't nothing, you are desperate for your allies to continue to communicate that you are the underdog, that it is, what was the old expression? I think Dan Rather used to call it tight as a tick, that there is no space for complacency. That said, the polls have to be a very encouraging sign inside the Harris campaign.
Well, the national poll, this particular one, is encouraging, certainly. I especially like the progress she's made on some pretty important issues to most voters, namely the economy, and how her favorability has ticked up. And I also like the enthusiasm that's recorded on her side of the equation. But having said that, national polls don't matter. Battleground state polls matter, and there's 7 of them. And just today, the same people that did this national poll pointed out that Trump is in a much better position in Arizona than she is, that Trump appears to be in a somewhat better position in Georgia than she is, that North Carolina is essentially tied. So we've got, and if you look at all of the battleground states, if you add in Nevada and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, these are all margin of error races. And we got 6 weeks. This is no time to go, oh, woof, we got this done. This is a time where the candidate and the campaign is desperately wanting people to stay engaged, enthusiastic, calling their friends in other states that are battleground states, doing whatever they can to help, volunteering, and making sure that those registered voters become likely voters on Harris's side of the equation.
Well, and Claire, that the likely voters are become Harris voters, right? It's both.
It's both.
It's turning out the low propensity voters to turn them into voters, and that's usually a lot of young voters, right, who may have gone off to college since they were paying attention over the summer, making sure they're registered where they're going to be in November, and then doing that final bit of persuasion. I want to show you, Claire, how our friend and colleague Steph Rule made an argument very effectively with someone who describes himself as undecided.
It's not too much to ask Kamala, say, are you for a Palestinian state if Hamas is going to run that state?
Okay.
Yes or no?
And let's say you don't like her answer. Are you going to vote for Donald Trump?
No, I'm not.
Kamala
I just said I'm not going to vote for her.
Harris is not running for perfect. She's running against Trump. We have two choices. And so there are some things you might not know her answer to. And in 2024, unlike 2016 for a lot of the American people, we know exactly what Trump will do, who he is, and the kind of threat he is to democracy.
I don't know.
So it's unclear to me how there could be an informed...
The problem that a lot of people have with Kamala is we don't know her answer to anything, okay?
But you know
and
his answer to everything.
And that's why I would never vote for him, and people shouldn't vote for him. But people also are expected to have some idea of what the program is of the person you're supposed to vote for. You're just not supposed to say, well, you have to vote for Y because X is this, that, and the other. Let's find out a little bit more. And I don't think it's a lot to ask her to sit down for a real interview as opposed to a puff piece in which she describes like her feelings of growing up in Oakland with nice lawns.
Then I would just say to that, when you move to Nirvana, give me your real estate broker's number and I'll be your next door neighbor. We don't live there.
You know, Claire, at some point, Dick Cheney knows enough about what Kamala Harris's policies are, and I know him pretty well. He cares a lot about national security policy. Liz Cheney cares an awful lot about national security policy. She knows enough about what Kamala Harris's policies are. So do Adam Kinzinger and Jeff Duncan, and lifelong Republican and McCain ally Mayor Giles of Arizona. I mean, this to me doesn't feel like it's about what people like that say it's about.
Yeah, listen, I think Kamala Harris has been in public life for a long time. Kamala Harris has set out her positions on some very important issues like housing and affordability issues and food and groceries. She certainly has stated her policies on how important the climate change issue is. And by the way, she has been very clear about what her position is in reproductive health freedom. Whereas, does Brett Stevens, does that guy know what Trump is going to do on that issue? He changes every 10 minutes on what he's saying about how he will treat women's essential freedom in terms of controlling her own body. And that's the other thing. It just drives me crazy, these Republicans saying, well, it's his policies. He can't put 3 sentences together about his policies. He gets a question about manufacturing in Michigan, and he goes on 10 minutes about countries that have a nuclear weapon. It's like, what? I mean, he isn't cogent about his policies, and I'm not sure these people even know what his policies are. All I know about his foreign policy is he loves dictators. That's all I know.
Well, David Jolly, Bret Stephens cares a lot about foreign policy. There's not a single person who saw Donald Trump in the sit room who's voting for him again. There's not a single person who saw Donald Trump in the tank briefings where the Pentagon briefed him on operations and crises who's voting for him again. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, gave a fiery speech saying that in America we don't swear an oath to a king or a dictator. We pledge an oath to the Constitution. There is not one person who saw him up close in a military or national. General Kelly, who was his chief of staff, said that he's the, quote, most damaged person he's ever seen in his life. Rex Tillerson, who was his Secretary of State, called him a moron. Bob Corker, Senate former chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said that the West Wing resembled adult daycare. You find me anyone who thinks that Donald Trump is a good bet on anything related to U.S. national security, and I'll send you a box of donuts.
Nicolle, say that all again. So louder, please. That's exactly, I think, the point that Stephanie Ruhle was trying to make in her exchange there, which is we now know Donald Trump's view of the world, his view of the country. We know his leadership. And for many people, they see him as a danger to constitutional order, constitutional norms, and to, frankly, the order on the world stage. And look, I think I didn't see the entire segment. So if Bret was being critical of Vice President Harris unduly, then he should be criticized. But I do think this is also an area where sometimes it's easy to hold Vice President Harris to a standard of perfection that she can't meet. She's not a perfect candidate. She came into this race 45 days ago. Some of her positions have changed, and there are questions she hasn't answered. But what we know is the value set she brings to the office, both for domestic policy and her view of the international order, her willingness to protect the constitutional norms, her willingness to protect personal freedoms, her willingness to fight for an opportunity economy for all people. We know her record with the Biden administration, helping lead a post-pandemic recovery that's the envy of the world. We know that the Biden-Harris administration has restored respect for the country on the world stage. Are there questions she hasn't answered? Of course. Of course there are. But to hold her to a standard of perfection, we're failing the real choice test here, which is what Stephanie Ruhle was trying to point out there, which is we know the danger that Donald Trump is. And I think where we see that reflected in the NBC poll, what fascinates me is the first question, are we going in the right direction or wrong direction? 65% of the country says we're going in the wrong direction. It's like 65 to 28 maybe. But the fascinating thing is within that poll, voters see Vice President Harris as the change agent, and she is. There's no faking this. Donald Trump, this is his third time as the major party nominee. We've seen him as president. He's not a change agent. Vice President Harris, this is her first time as a presidential nominee who's offering her view of the world. The American people see that as change, and they say that is the change we want, particularly compared with Donald Trump.
Eddie, how do you see the contest and the conversation about the contest?
Well, you know, I thought that Stephanie was engaged in an interesting pedagogical moment with Bret, right? And the question was, okay, if it's the case that she doesn't hold these positions, are you going to vote for Donald Trump? Right? So part of what we see with Bret is that there's this kind of worry that Kamala Harris is going to turn out to be a liberal. Perhaps she is. But does it follow from that fact that you can't not vote for her because your identity is so constituted as a conservative that you're willing to hand over the country to someone like Donald Trump? And that's what she was trying to say to them. You can't make her into you. She's not her policies are not going to be aligned with Project 2025. Her projects are not going to be aligned with moderate Republicans or so. She is who she is, and we can begin to detail that over the course of her career. We can't morph her into something else, but the question for the coalition, the broad coalition, is that she is who she is, and Donald Trump is who he is. Where do you land?
I think the other thing is, for them, it's about them.
Of course. Exactly.
Because there is a voter, I think Mitch McConnell and Bill Barr are the same kind of, and I don't know, I mean, Bret's made clear he's not going to vote for Trump. So